This video is sponsored by World Anvil. Well, it's the holiday season, so let's talk about death. It's very strange how some of these videos have landed on the schedule. Specifically, we're talking about killing off player characters in D&D and similar RPGs. Now, some people will very understandably argue that you need to have a risk of death in your games in order to have stakes. And in an action-adventure RPG like D&D, I think that's a valid perspective, although I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. Really, I think it's primarily true because most encounters are structured as battles to the death between two sides, but that's a larger topic for another day. And even if you were to solve that problem, even if you have lots of different types of encounters that have other win conditions, the very nature of how most D&D classes and monsters work pretty much demands that you will have some battles to the death. And for some people, that's where the conversation ends. D&D campaigns include battles to the death, so player characters can die too. But I don't think everybody fully interrogates the many different ways death can be handled, or how you can have totally different approaches depending on the campaign, the setting, the players, and the characters. And that's what we're talking about today. Now, before we get into how different types of character death might be right for different campaigns, let's establish a baseline. There are two extremely common approaches to death in D&D: backup characters and resurrection. First, we're going to talk about resurrection. This is the approach that the game itself assumes your players will want to go with because it offers spells like Revivify, Raise Dead, Reincarnate, which is my personal favorite, Resurrection, and True Resurrection. Each one is better and higher level than the one before. For example, Revivify is a 3rd level spell and only costs 300 gold worth of diamonds, but must be cast within a minute of character death. Raise Dead is a 5th level spell, costs 500 gold worth of diamonds, and must be cast within 10 days of character death. Reincarnate is the druid version of Raise Dead. It's also 5th level, costs 1,000 gold worth of rare oils, also has a 10-day restriction, but it changes the character into a new random ancestry, which is just so much fun. It's like a Doctor Who regeneration, except if you could switch from a half-elf to a dwarf or a dragonborn. Resurrection is 7th level, costs 1,000 gold, and has a limit of 100 years. And True Resurrection is 9th level, costs 25,000 gold, and has a limit of 200 years. There are some other differences when it comes to the lingering effects and injuries of the resurrected person, but basically, those are the spells. And so, eventually, as you hit higher levels, death and resurrection just becomes part of the gameplay loop. That's not to say that there's still no consequence to death, but compared to most fiction and folklore, yeah, there's basically no consequence. Besides the cost of gold for each spell, of course, and that's actually not a huge consequence. In fact, it's kind of a good thing, because players need to spend their money on things or they'll just keep hoarding gold indefinitely. So making them spend money on resurrection actually helps players in the long run by giving them a goal they can put money toward. Buying diamonds for future resurrections is the D&D character equivalent of having a savings account. It's setting something aside for a rainy day. Now, obviously, that's a lot of different ways to resurrect dead characters, and in theory, your players could find an NPC that can cast one of those spells if they aren't available to the players themselves. But that gets into the question of spellcasting services available through NPCs, and I made a whole other video about that, link in the corner and in the doobly-doo. And I think the reason that there are so many different options for resurrection has a lot to do with the change in how D&D campaigns are structured, the shift that occurred over the past few decades. See, in the original days, it was more common for the adventure to be structured around a single location. If a character died, you'd bring in another character, and we'll talk about that shortly. But it was easy to justify that, because you could always find another treasure hunter willing to explore a dungeon for some loot. And it not only made sense that your party would want to find someone to fill out their crew, but that there would be individual adventurers looking to join a larger group of treasure hunters. But post-Dragonlance, a lot of D&D adventures started being structured around storylines instead of locations. And when your characters are pursuing some villains or MacGuffins rather than just raiding a dangerous location for loot, then it gets harder and harder to justify new reasons why your replacement characters would automatically care about all the same things your dead character did. Isn't it just so much easier to resurrect the character so you can keep the story moving forward with the same characters who care about the same stuff? Add to that the influence of video game RPGs and serialized television, and you have lots of different influences that impact how badly players just want to keep playing the same character through the entire campaign. Now, I should clarify, I have no idea how common resurrection spells were in older editions, although I think that, at least at a certain point during the history of the hobby, I think you lost a level or you lost experience points when you were resurrected, but honestly, the specifics of those spells are not really the point. Instead, I'm talking about how the change in campaign design changed the gameplay loop, and that basically pushed the hobby toward the assumption that if your character dies, you'll want to revive them. And given how many old school players and GMs roll their eyes at the idea of character resurrection, it seems like that assumption just wasn't there at all, or at least wasn't as strong in the older days of the hobby. Because for lots of different reasons, there are plenty of GMs who don't like the way resurrection is treated in 5th edition. Maybe they don't even have an issue with the concept of resurrection on its own, but maybe just how easily characters can be resurrected. After all, in folklore and fiction, it's a lot harder to bring fallen friends back from the dead. You need to go on a quest, or petition the gods, or make a deal with the devil, or whatever. But you certainly can't just go buy some diamonds and then cast a single spell, or go to the temple and just buy yourself a resurrection. Now, some GMs adjust resurrection in their games, so it's just more challenging. For example, in Matt Mercer's Critical Role campaigns, you can just use diamonds to cast resurrection spells, or buy one from a temple if you're in a large city. But there are also actual dice rolls required, because he still feels there should be a chance of failure. Narratively, these are rituals where the party petitions the soul to return, or makes offers to deities to guide the soul back to the body. But structurally, they're just skill challenges. But what this looks like in your game might depend entirely on your own needs. For example, maybe when the party casts a resurrection spell, you could describe the weather turning foul, like a concentrated storm, a hurricane, focused on the caster, as they're effectively trying to break the laws of nature and reverse a death. And maybe the caster has to make a check or a series of checks to maintain their focus long enough to cast the spell. Or maybe you have to seek out or evoke some higher power, good or evil, and give up something in order to resurrect your friend. No rolls required, just a sufficient sacrifice. Heck, maybe you just inflate the prices of the material components, because diamonds would clearly be worth a lot more in a fictional world where some people can use diamonds to bring back the dead. But think about what you think is cool about D&D, and what you think is cool about resurrection stories, and where those could potentially overlap, and use that as your North Star to determine what resurrection could look like in your games. Of course, as I said earlier, some people drop resurrection entirely from their games. In those cases, when a character dies, you don't just stop playing with that player, the player rolls up a new character. The major selling point of this approach is to reinforce the idea that life is cheap. That's why this method is so common in more old school games, and especially modern OSR games that model older versions of D&D. Even in the 5th edition module Tomb of Annihilation, resurrection magic has just stopped working, so there is no way to resurrect characters. So yeah, everyone's probably going to roll up a backup character instead. But that's not even the only reason players might want to have backup characters. Heck, in plenty of 5th edition games I've run where resurrection is potentially on the table, it sometimes still just makes more sense for players to roll up new characters. And this could be for any number of reasons. Maybe the bodies of the fallen PCs can't be recovered. I once ran a game for 4 druids, and after they were 9th level, there were plenty of folks who could cast Reincarnate. But when one of them failed to run away fast enough and got snapped up by a red dragon as they were fleeing the dungeon, there wasn't anything they could do for him, so he just rolled up a new character. That was a particularly extreme and epic example, but sometimes it can be as simple as, we all had to run out of the dungeon and the bodies got left behind. Or, we're in the middle of the forest and can't find anyone to revive the body right now. And then of course, sometimes the character's death is satisfying, and the player actually doesn't feel the need to bring the character back to life. I talked about one example of that in this video where our barbarian revealed she was a revenant, and once she got revenge, she collapsed dead, and that was a satisfying ending for that character. However, maybe sometimes you just want to try playing a new character instead. You played a character, they died, and you're like, yeah, that's okay. I'm actually thinking about playing a wizard instead. And so, yeah, time to roll up a backup character. Now, there are a lot of different ways to handle the concept of backup characters and what expectations you have for your players. The first is a question that you all need to be on the same page about. Is the backup character temporary? In 2 campaigns I ran, and 1 game I played in, a player still wanted to bring their dead character back to life, but we introduced a backup character they could play until the party could find somebody to bring the dead PC back to life. That's totally fine as long as everyone is on the same page about that fact, and as long as everyone knows how high that character resurrection is on the list of priorities. Even if it's not very high, even if it just becomes part of the final session to bring that PC back once the adventure is completed, it's still good to have some clarity there. But the next 2 questions are really things you should discuss very early on, ideally during session 0. If you expect your players to roll up new characters when their current characters die, should they already have a backup character in mind? And second question, should everybody already have a backup character fully rolled up? Your answers to these questions will depend entirely on how quickly you plan to introduce a new character after the first character dies. Will they just show up on the next round of combat? Will they arrive once the combat is over? Will they be waiting nearby whenever the party leaves the current area and returns to a place of safety? Will you just absolutely not introduce them in the same session to give the players a chance to process the character's death and potentially roleplay some sort of last rites and mourning period? This depends a lot on your style and what the players are looking for from the game. Along those same lines, there are other games that take completely different approaches to how death works, depending on what works best for that style of campaign. As I alluded to earlier, a lot of OSR old school games inspired by the earlier, grittier days of D&D strip out a lot of resurrection magic. But if we widen our field a bit, we can see other games that take completely different approaches. One of my favorite go-to examples is the powered by the apocalypse game Masks: A New Generation. Not because it's my favorite game ever, although I do like it, but it's also such a useful example to highlight a completely different approach to damage and death. It's a teenage superhero RPG. It's inspired by things like Teen Titans and Young Avengers. And the designers opted not to include hit points because in a game like D&D, every fight, from a couple of goblins to a couple of mummy lords, always targets your hit points. So in theory, you could get killed by a couple of bandits at any level, no matter what adventure you're on. And while I'm certainly not going to imply that superheroes never die, they rarely die at the hands of a random burglar. They die in big, dramatic narrative moments, and they hardly ever stay dead. So mostly in Masks, you don't take damage because the risk isn't death. That doesn't fit the style of campaign. The risk is trauma. Your character sustains emotional repercussions. Their self-esteem suffers. They think of themselves as untrustworthy, or they start to believe that they're the monster they've always been worried about. And if you do want to play a character who will die one day, you could play the Doomed, modeled after someone like Raven from Teen Titans. It's a character who has some sort of big prophecy, and one day they are inevitably going to die. I would also argue that Iron Lad from Young Avengers is a version of this as well, since he has a fate he's not able to escape. But the point is, that's a game where hardly any of the characters are going to die, but that's appropriate for the types of stories that that game is structured for. And there are still consequences throughout combat to make up for the absence of life-threatening stakes. I'm really itching to play Masks again, although honestly there are a lot of Powered by the Apocalypse games that I wish I could run or play in for like just a year-long campaign. Maybe someday, when I have free time again. Now, to give you an example of the different ways death can work in your campaigns, I want to talk about how death works in my games. And the answer is, it depends on the campaign. For example, whenever I run Curse of Strahd, I'm very explicit that the players don't need backup characters. If their character dies and they decide to roll up a replacement character, that's fine, but there will always be some way to bring the character back. Sometimes this will come with a cost, and that gets into one of the central themes of my Strahd games. The dramatic question isn't whether the characters will survive, it's what they will become, and what sort of toll the campaign will take on them. This works especially well because I run Strahd where all the player characters are teenagers from our world, so they're not coming into the adventure as badass adventurers. But this is what I'm talking about. Can you find an approach to death that not only facilitates the fun of the players, but also reinforces the themes of your campaign or your world? On the flip side, as a complete opposite example, a couple of years ago my friends and I got together to play through Tomb of Horrors, and everyone was told to bring like 5 backup characters. We decided that there were a bunch of other adventurers in the party just waiting outside the dungeon. And whenever somebody died, we basically explained that we kind of called someone down to join us, and so that adventurer would follow us and meet up with the rest of the party. How that adventurer theoretically navigated the incredibly lethal dungeon we had already traversed, I have no idea. But for a very casual game played entirely so we could say that we'd done it, for bragging rights, completely, it really didn't matter. Fun fact, through sheer dumb luck, I was the only player whose first character survived the dungeon. Although it did require one generous ruling from my GM, maybe I'll tell that story another day. I'm also hoping to run a short Shadowdark campaign early next year, and in that game, I know that players would need to roll new characters whenever their character dies. But I'm currently debating the best way to handle that. I'm not wild about the approach we used for Tomb of Horrors, where somebody just showed up with no explanation, but honestly, if all the party members have some sort of magic item that links them with other off-screen characters, that might help explain it. When somebody dies, their body is teleported away and replaced with another willing adventurer. But while that's a fun idea, I think it undercuts the gravity of a game like Shadowdark dramatically. I mean, it literally makes a TPK impossible. So I think I tell my players, if you die, you can roll a new character, but they will join after combat. Or maybe I just ask my players what they'd want and we talk through it together. Because ultimately, it doesn't really matter that you decide how death works. Your players have to be on board with it as well. Yes, you could just lay down the law and tell them this is how it is, but if you're going to have a campaign-specific approach to character death, I'd really recommend you do that before they even join the game, and let them know so they know what to expect. Even if you're more the kind of GM to say, I don't know how it'll work yet, but if you want to come back to life, we'll figure it out, and if you want to roll up a new character, here's how quickly you could expect them to join the game, and you don't have to decide which way you're going until the moment arrives, then that is still a specific approach to death, and I still recommend you let the players know in advance that this is how death works in your campaign. Similar to the idea just pitched for Shadowdark that I don't think would work for that game, I've had lots of ideas for a 5e campaign where all the characters would be members of a larger organization, and so each one of them would have a minor magic item that displays what the player character would like done with their remains. Do they want the party to try to resurrect them, or would they rather be laid to rest? This would give the player and their character agency about what they want to do. And it also gives the other PCs a chance to respond realistically and authentically while still being fully aware of what the player wants and not going on a wild goose chase to resurrect someone who actually has no interest in coming back to life. Of course, if all of your player characters are part of a larger faction, it can be a lot to ask all of your players to remember all of the information about that organization, including the NPCs, the fictional history, their mission statement. That would be a lot to keep track of. Let's use today's sponsor, World Anvil. World Anvil is a fantastic online toolkit that you can use to create articles to share with your players, so they have all the information they need about NPCs, locations, magic items, monsters, villains, and more. Plus, you can make sure certain information is presented at character creation, so your players know what rules you're using, what resources you're allowing, and of course, whether there's anything major they need to know, like what happens to their characters when they die. And World Anvil is offering a discount to the viewers of this channel. If you visit worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK, you can save 40% off of any annual membership. Once again, that's worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK. Thank you so much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments, how do you handle death in your tabletop RPG campaigns? Does it depend on the campaign? If you like this video and you want to see more like it, check out the like button and the subscribe button and the bell button. If you want to help support the channel financially, check out my Patreon. I've got some awesome stuff coming, hopefully very soon. Want to hang out with other awesome people? Check out my Discord server. Want to stay up to date with my latest news? Check out my newsletter. All those links are in the doobly-doo below. As I said, this topic is something that's important to discuss before the campaign, so if you'd like some guidance on these types of discussions, check out my video about Session Zeros. Until next time, play fair and have fun.